there are many challenges in academia. Maybe some of the most obvious are how the publishing process is organized. I don't know how is the situation in MIT, but in many, many labs, you have this kind of a postdoc crisis where highly trained PhD students, they decide to leave academia because of many reasons. We have also, in many, many cases, problems with reproducibility. There are some experiments that cannot be reproduced somewhere else. Power abuse is some topic, many, many others. Maybe it would be very interesting if you pick up one of these or suggest some other big problem in academia. There are definitely such. And let's discuss it.
Well, I think there's a meta problem that's behind all the problems, right? Which is, how do you change things? And for many years, some of the graduate students in my group would write their last thesis chapter about how they would change science if they were in charge. And now many of them have been creating new kinds of idea of how you can start academic environments or academia-like environments. So for example, two of the alumni from our group came up with this idea of the FRO, Focused Research Organization, a nonprofit startup, if you will. And now I think about a dozen of them are out there. The first one was a spin out from the group called E11, which is trying to take the expansion microscopy method and scale it up to the entire mouse brain. And so they're in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so, yeah, it's a nonprofit institute. The CEO is a former graduate student from our group. It's a much more collaborative environment, let's say, than a situation where somebody might want to be the first author or co-first author of a paper. Now you can have a team that works together because the incentive structures are different, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the better problem is, how do you create change, right? I think the idea is to facilitate that, right?
Mm-hmm. So your take on is just encourage students to think differently and think what would they change if they could, and then changing it by basically setting up examples. As you mentioned, they have these companies and they have these discoveries and organizations. But sometimes this is quite hard because, as you know, this is kind of a system that is very, kind of old one and set up in stone. And there are quite a lot of powerful people on top that kind of move around and they make the field, etc. How can we, besides setting up example, is there any way to maybe talk to these people and change the rules probably, or the way how science is done, so that we have kind of bottom-up approach on one hand with the students who introduce this innovation and innovative thinking, and also top-down approach where people actually who have been doing science for many, many years and know the field, they also contribute to the changes?
Yeah, I think that sounds great. Yeah, I think if people can engage and cause change through action, that's the best.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a very interesting quote from Richard Buckminster Fuller. Very interesting person. I will paraphrase it, but basically it is: you never change the existing reality by fighting the system. You change it by creating a new system that makes the old one obsolete. So probably this is exactly the right way to encourage young people to start thinking differently and start creating their own science, I think.
Well, and also you have to think about how to affect the change, right?
Mm-hmm.
People like to talk about change, but how do you make it reality, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's where it goes back to this idea of aligning incentives, right? So when I was having a lot of trouble getting this idea of neurotechnology more accepted, that's why we started sharing tools freely, right? We want everybody to try them out and see if they're useful, and people adopt them out of their own self-interest, and then that helps us because now we have so-called customers for the tools, and so over time you can cause change, I think. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to cause change, though, if the incentives are not aligned. So I think an example there would be like lots of people want to change how publishing is done, right? But if universities still continue to hire people who publish in the same small number of journals, then the incentives are not aligned. Mm-hmm. And creating venues to publish if they're not respected by the hiring committees, then the incentives are disconnected. And so I think that's where you have to figure. You either have to persuade people of the value of something, which I think is starting to happen, which is good, or you have to be able to align the incentives, which is also something that needs to be thought about very carefully.
What's your take on bioRxiv?
Oh, I love it. Yeah. We put lots of stuff in bioRxiv.
Yeah. I also think it's amazing, and it's there are plenty of examples of people putting their work on bioRxiv and then getting hired basically because of their work on bioRxiv and not because of their work that was published in these big journals that you've mentioned, some of them, which are very impactful. So people get to recognize it even more and more and more. And I don't know how is the funding bodies, how are the funding bodies in the US, but let's say if you have several papers on bioRxiv, are they considered, or they have to be really peer reviewed officially?
Well, I think they are considered, but the reviewers of a grant are people with their own backgrounds, biases, and subjective points of view. So if you are lucky and get a reviewer who values bioRxiv, that's great. But I don't know if everybody values it equally. So the review process, of course, has always a stochastic component to it.
I think when we boil it down, it's always human behavior. It doesn't matter the system. I mean, we are humans, we create the system, right? So if our behavior is a little bit off of what we think is good or normal, then yes, the system will be also suffering from some disadvantages. In this case, as you mentioned, like personal bias or some interesting vicious circle, if you wish, with the publishing industry and other problems. But yeah, if you can solve one of these problems, what would be it? Just like you have the magic stick and you solve it today, what would this be? In terms of challenges in academia, I mean.
I think there's an overarching question of how to judge people and plans based upon the future, right? So if I'm applying for a grad school, or if I'm applying for a faculty job, or if I'm writing a grant, I'm basically being judged for things that haven't necessarily happened yet. I mean, and so there are things that you rely upon, like track record and so forth, but those things can have flaws as well, right? So if somebody was lucky and grew up near a university and had lots of research experiences when they were young, they might look better on paper than somebody who hasn't done that, and that could lead to inequities in a system and magnify them. So I think one thing that I think a lot about, and I think it would be my choice to answer your question, would be to create alternative ways of evaluating that really get to what will the future of a person or plan be like. And so one thought is let's just pick the example of grants, because I think it's maybe a little bit more concrete. But if a grant is, so let's say a grant gets submitted and it gets 3 numerical scores, and one is a perfect score and the other 2 are very bad scores, right? Well, those 3 people can't all be correct, right? Because they contradict each other. So is there a way to understand why there's a difference in the scores, right? Is there a way to take, things to the realm of opinion and be more quantitative about it, be more logical about it, look at the underpinnings that underlie the decision. So that's something I think a lot about in terms of evaluation. And it can be tricky. So I volunteer for a foundation called the Hertz Foundation, for example, which gives out 5-year graduate fellowships. So it's a lot of money and it gives people a lot of freedom. And one thing that I'm one of the interviewers for it. One of the things that I think a lot about is, are there questions one could ask or things you could talk about that could unveil, how somebody thinks about things in a way that, kind of points out how they approach things creatively, or how they deconstruct problems, or how they deal with complexity. But it's not necessarily just because of a specific kind of experience that they had, or because of a particular event that occurred at a previous point in their life, And so, I think a lot about kind of how do we help evaluate these kinds of things. And this applies at every stage, right? Getting into grad school, getting a faculty job, winning an award, getting a grant, so many such things. And yes, there's a lot of talk about publishing, which is evaluating things once they're done. But I think that there needs to be as much discussion about evaluating things that haven't been done.
Interesting. Do you think that artificial intelligence might play a role in evaluating people? What I mean is creating some kind of a system that will be as unbiased as possible. Of course, you might introduce bias when you create the system per se, but do you think this can be helpful in assisting, maybe not evaluating per se, but assisting in this kind of evaluation processes?
I don't know. I mean, the burden of proof would be on whoever created that system to prove that it worked, right? Yeah. I mean, science is notoriously hard to solve with AI, right? And many people are trying, but AIs tend to be very good at doing more of what they've already done, right? So, text generation or image generation, they can build from things that they've been trained on. But science is about the unknown, right? And so, I think there's a lot of excitement going forward about what AI could do for science. But has an AI proven that it can, do things like evaluate a person for a scientific future? I haven't seen that myself.
That is true. That is true. Maybe at some point in the future, who knows? Maybe there will be another model that is even more advanced, but we don't know and we cannot say anything about the future. Professor Boyden, I would like to thank you once again for the wonderful insights and for a great conversation.
Great talking to you today.